Well, Sheila Gregoire, thank you so much for joining us on A Pastor and a Philosopher Walk Into a Bar.
Awesome. This is exciting. I saw your questions and I'm so jazzed for this interview.
Nice.
So
Super fun, which is remarkable because I think you said this is maybe number 76 or 77 interviews that you've done for this book.
yeah, but you've got interesting questions. Not that other people didn't, but like, you're kind of out there. So that's awesome.
Fun, fun. Well, so Sheila, truth be told, so you have two books that we're super interested in. The newest book is called She Deserves Better, which is basically the subtitle is Raising Girls to Resist Toxic Teachings on Sex, Self, and Speaking Up. I have a 16-year-old daughter, and I'm very, very interested in what you guys had to say. And it's a great book, highly recommended if you have a daughter or if you are considering parenting, or for really just anyone in a relationship needs to read this book, I would say. And then also Kyle read your former book. What is that, Kyle?
Yeah, it's called The Great Sex Rescue, which includes some really interesting original research about evangelical sex advice and the effect it's had on primarily women, but men too, in purity culture kind of spaces. And yeah, so I have some questions on the outline about that as well. If it's okay, I'd love to pick your brain about it a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So let's start though with She Deserves Better. Your work, Sheila, has been centered around, marriage and sex quite a bit. And this is a bit of a departure, but doesn't seem like that much of a departure at all. So can you just tell our listeners who you are, how you got to the place where you wrote these books, and where this particular book, She Deserves Better, came from?
Okay, so this is going to be a long story that I'm going to try to make super short. So, I did a bunch of grad degrees while my husband was in med school, and then I was a stay-at-home mom, and I was kind of bored, so I started becoming a mommy blogger in 2008 because that's what everybody was doing. So I was like all housework and organizing and stuff. And the more I talked about sex, the more my traffic grew. So I became like this weird Christian sex lady,
Like
and
a
I
Chris
did that for about a decade. Yeah, like nobody grows up thinking I want to be the Christian sex lady. Like that's just odd. But I did that for about a decade, and then I did something radical, which is I read another Christian marriage book, and I hadn't done that because I wasn't going to plagiarize. And so I just had not looked at all these books that were on my shelf. But one day I pulled down Love and Respect, and it changed my life because it was so horrid. Like he said, if your husband is typical, he has a need you don't have. The need is for physical release. If you don't give him physical release, he'll come under satanic attack and have an affair. And affairs are caused by women not having sex. And there was not a word about intimacy. There wasn't a word about women's pleasure. And we all freaked out on my team. We wrote to focus on the family because I knew the folks there, and they ignored us. So we decided to go big or go home, and we did the largest study on evangelical women's marriage and sexual satisfaction that's ever been done, which is Great Sex Rescue. And then people said, okay, great, but this is wonderful, but how do I raise my kids? Because I don't want to give them the toxic stuff, but I don't know what to say now. And so we did another project of 7,000 women this time, and it became She Deserves Better.
Mm-hmm. So your book, She Deserves Better, is very upfront about being geared towards moms, just the way it's laid out, with the reflections for moms and daughters after the chapters. And I think you give a little acknowledgement to moms. I'm a dad of a daughter. So I was just wondering, I just wanted to hear from you, why not dads as well?
You know, this is going to sound awful, but when we started writing, publishers told us that men won't read your books.
Mm.
And now Baker didn't say that, but other publishers have. And so we always thought of ourselves as writers to women. And then with Great Sex Rescue, all these men read it too. With She Deserves Better, though, we did see it more geared towards women for the simple fact that it's written for moms of daughters, but it's also kind of written for moms to reparent themselves
Yeah.
because so many women heard such terribly toxic stuff. And this is really directed at a lot of millennial moms who grew up in the purity culture. So even though it's for moms of daughters, I think it's almost more for women to reparent themselves. But I think it's great for guys to read too, just to understand what women went through.
Really, really important to understand what women went through, and really important for dads trying their best to parent a teenage daughter. I think in my case, I feel like I'm at a disability because I wasn't a teenage girl. And I've been playing catch up for, she's been a teenager for 4 years, but I've been playing catch up for about 4.5 to 5 years, because 12 was, monstrous years as well. And by monstrous, I mean just mega. It was major. So I've been talking about the 16-year-old daughter I have, Sheila. Can you just tell me in 2 minutes or less everything that I need to know about raising her?
I'll tell you the one biggest thing
Yes, please.
is raise a girl who can disagree with you.
Oh,
If you do that, you're set. Because if she can disagree with you well, like not as a I hate you, dad, but as a no, I don't think I like that. Or you know what, I really don't want to do that. If she can speak up to you, then she can speak up when she's in a toxic friend group. Then she can speak up when she's in a bad relationship. Then she can speak up when she's in a bad church. Because if she can disagree, what you're telling her is your opinion matters.
Huh.
Your words matter. You matter. You don't need to just conform to me and be compliant.
Mm-hmm.
And our girls need to know that their words matter.
Oh man, that's good.
Right?
Now Kyle will ask his questions, and I'm going to be over here repenting of my sins. That's so good, Sheila. Thank you.
Yeah, and you don't know this, but like disagreement and how to do it well is a central theme of our podcast. It's
that's awesome.
And humility, and how to dialogue with people who are smarter than you or who disagree with you. So, and we have not applied it to parenting or to sex because we don't talk about those things. So it's really good to have you on. Can you be a little more concrete about how to do that in practice? I don't have a daughter. I have a 2-year-old son, and another kid on the way. But hopefully someday this will be a thing I'll need to think about. So I know a lot about disagreeing with peers. I know a lot about disagreeing with experts. That's my research. But I don't know a lot about disagreeing with my kids. So how do you do that well?
One of the things that we do with kids is if we ask them to do something, we expect them to show an attitude like, I am absolutely ecstatic doing this for you, Dad. So it's not enough just to get it done and get it done well. They have to look like they're enjoying it. So what we're really trying to do is control their feelings. So if we say, go clean your room, and they're cleaning it, but they're stomping around and glaring at you if you look in, we make a real issue out of that often. And I've seen, often kids get punished for their attitude. Now, I'm not saying that a child should be allowed to disrespect you, but if they're honestly unhappy, but they are getting it done and they're doing it well, can that be enough? Because when we force kids to portray a feeling that they're not actually feeling, that's telling them that you're supposed to put on a happy face and your feelings should be squashed. And it's very important that our girls especially learn to honor their feelings. It's their feelings that are going to show that's their little spidey senses that are like, I'm uncomfortable in this situation. I don't like this situation. I think I should leave. Like those are their feelings that tell them that. And if we're saying, nah, no matter what you're feeling, you've got to be happy and you've got to make other people think you're happy. That's a bad thing for girls to learn.
Yeah. That's really good.
Yeah.
Now, again, they need to be polite. They need to treat their siblings politely. But if they're in their room and they're upset, they're allowed to be upset.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. It's making so much sense to me right now how purity culture damaged so many people, especially girls, but boys too, because that cuts right to the quick of the whole like theological architecture it's founded on. You can't really, we've talked about this on the podcast a lot, you can't really have evangelical theology or biblical studies, or I guess views of sex or hermeneutics around that without a kind of pretense. It won't really stand without putting on a happy face about a lot of crap in the world and pretending that it's not the way it seems to you to be. That's powerful. I'm going to be thinking a lot about what you said.
Oh, yeah. I'm going to re-listen to this, and then we're going to probably ask you to come on again, Sheila, just to unpack this thing you just said. Because
you should have my daughter on, and she can tell you all the ways I didn't do this, so it'll be great. Yeah.
That would make me feel affirmed a little bit. In chapter 5, the chapter about dating, you quoted a mom who I think speaks for pretty much all of us ex-evangelical parents. I'm quoting her now. She said, I struggle with changing my thought process from how I was taught as a teen to a more balanced view as I raise my own teens. Avoidance is not the key, but often I don't know what to tell them about healthy relationships. I don't want them sleeping around, but I don't want to give them sex phobia either. End quote. That's a question I hear really often as a pastor, and that's a question I think about as a parent. What do you think is a better way than what purity culture of the 90s and 2000s gave us, Sheila?
Anything is a better way than what
That's fair. That's fair.
um okay, the problem with purity culture, and when I'm talking about purity culture, I'm not talking about the idea that sex should just be in marriage. I mean, because that's been part of the Christian church for quite a while now. You can debate what marriage meant, and I think there's some valid conversations to be had on that. But the idea that sex is meant for marriage has been kind of standard in Christianity for quite a while. What hasn't been standard and what purity culture brought to us was the idea that your faith is determined by your virginity and by your adherence to those rules. I grew up in the 80s, so I was a Gen X. And if you were to ask me when I was 16 what it meant to be a Christian, I would have told you about praying and about learning how to give my testimony to my school and thinking about sex trafficking. We were really involved in worrying about Cambodia. Praying through the 1040 window in missions. Like, we were so focused on evangelism and missions. And yes, sex would have come up, but it was sort of like an assumed thing that we didn't actually talk about that much. And then purity culture came, and that was all that was talked about. We looked at all of these books for teen girls, and we just chose any book. We reviewed all the main books that were written to teen girls during purity culture. They were all just about relationships. Like, it wasn't that we chose the relationship books for girls. It's like that is all that was talked about, was how to stay virgin. And so purity culture really was, hey, your faith is determined by whether or not you're a virgin. And that is so damaging. Because first of all, virginity can be taken from you. But also, that's not Christianity. You know, Jesus said, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation, and she is a new creation, and that his mercies are new every morning. Like, our purity isn't based on what we do with our bodies. Our purity is based on what Jesus did with his. And the ethic is not virginity. The ethic is chastity, which is just simply treating others with dignity and respect and putting sex in its proper place. And that's something that you can choose every day, no matter what you did yesterday. And we really messed that up because we made people do this all or nothing thinking. So we taught girls to protect their virginity, but we never taught them to protect themselves. So once their virginity is gone, there's no point in saying no anymore, because the reason they were saying no was to protect their virginity. So if their virginity is gone, then I don't have a reason to say no to him. And it's just really harmful. So I just think, you know what? Let's just tell our kids the truth. I know this is wild, but let's just, first of all, let's tell kids about sex ed. In our survey of 7,000 women, there is no downside to information. There's absolutely no downside. The more information girls have and the younger they have it, the better their self-esteem, the less the likelihood of having multiple sex partners, the better their future marital and sexual satisfaction. If they get married, the less likelihood they have of marrying an abuser. Like, there is no downside. So let's give them information and then just talk to them honestly about what choices you want them to make, why you want them to make those choices, but realize they may not make the choices you want them to make. And at different ages, those choices are about different things. That's something purity culture, I think, lost. Like, we gave the same message whether you were 23 or 33 or 13.
Yes.
And my message to a 13-year-old about sex would be very different from my message to an 18-year-old or to a 24-year-old.
Yeah.
Even if you still want them to wait for marriage, the way you talk about it is different.
Yeah. Can you give us an example of how it's different? I'm thinking back to, like, I don't know, like church events I've sat through where it'll be billed as, we're going to bring a bunch of people together and talk about singleness, or we're going to bring a bunch of people together and talk about sex or celibacy or whatever. And, ostensibly to give you a more thoughtful take on this kind of thing. And you get there and it's the same old stuff. I've heard somebody say in the same breath almost, like, they'll decry the metaphors that you heard in middle school purity culture, and then 10 minutes later they're just given an alternative version of the same metaphor that just seems slightly more sophisticated, but it's not. In substance, it's the same view. Almost like Christians just haven't thought of a better alternative. We haven't thought of a more sophisticated way to talk about this, not in substance. So Can you give maybe a concrete example of what that could look like?
Yeah, well, they're 13. You just say, babe, I love you. And I know a lot of your friends are doing stuff, but you're 13. You are under the age of consent. And as your parent, I need to protect you. And so this is not something you should be doing. So it's not even a moral thing. It's like, this is a health and safety. And all that, so at 13 is different. At 18 or at 16, you just say, you know what? Totally normal to have sexual feelings. You're going to have sexual feelings. That's part of being how you were made. That's a good thing. But you need to decide what you want to do. And parents may have different views on this. I encourage my kids to wait for marriage. I know not everybody does, but you probably at least want them to be in a committed relationship. You want them to feel safe. And so, decide about that. And so decide on what your boundaries are going to be. Like, have a plan. But even more important than that, honor the boundaries of the person you're with. And if the person that you're with doesn't honor your boundaries, that is a huge red flag that you need to get out of that relationship, because that's not safe.
Yeah.
And then when they're older, like, yeah, just say, hey, I want you to have healthy relationships. Here's what a healthy relationship looks like to me. What does it look like to you? What are you looking for? And just talk to your kids. Just talk to them when they're young adults.
And be willing to be disagreed with.
Yeah. But no matter what, even if your child disagrees with you, or your young adult child disagrees with you, you still want them to make good choices. You don't want them to be with an abuser. You don't want them practicing something which is unhealthy. And so you can at least have those discussions, and then, tell them, if you do want them to wait, tell them why.
Mm-hmm.
And it can't just be because I'm afraid that God will be mad at you.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
No, that's really great. So I want to, if we can, zoom out a little bit for a few moments. So I'm the philosophy half of the podcast, which is probably a little bit unusual for the types of interviews you probably have about your books. And so I'm going to do the philosopher thing and say, well, what about the foundations here? Let's examine our methodology for a few minutes. I'm just be straight. I've not read, outside of The Great Sex Rescue, almost any evangelical sex books or books by former evangelicals about sex. And after reading that book, I'm kind of glad. Praise the Lord, right? Because unless you count like Elizabeth Elliot as a evangelical sex book, which maybe it is. I don't know. Maybe that's like the zenith of that genre.
Oh yeah.
But having read recently a couple other sex-related books from progressive Christian and secular authors. So, for example, I read Nadia Bolz-Weber's book from 2020, which kind of lays out a sexual ethic. I read recently, I don't know if you've heard of Amiya Srinivasan's book, The Right to Sex, a very well-known Oxford philosopher. Very different takes, dealing with very different issues, but they're kind of floating in my head while I'm reading your book. And so it made me wonder about a broader question that I've had for a long time, and I want to pose it for you. And that is, how do you build a sexual ethic? What are you rooted in? How do you think we should proceed in constructing an ethic and deciding what's out of bounds, what's immoral, what's good? For example, Nadia does it by rooting it in a kind of concern. Most secular accounts rooted in some kind of account of happiness or some kind of, a virtue ethic or a utilitarian ethic or a deontology or something like that. Not always explicitly, but it's in there somewhere if you dig for it. Most Christians, of course, rooted in some kind of idea of love or maybe order. The evangelicals and the conservatives are all about order. So how do you pick a foundation, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Can I back up a bit?
Absolutely.
Okay. So I think when we were thinking about this, because we've talked about this as a team a lot, a sexual ethic has to apply to you whether you are married or whether you are single. And that's part of the problem with the evangelical sexual ethic, is because our ethic was mostly, as long as it's in marriage, it's good.
Yeah.
So it is marriage that makes it good. For instance, Tim Keller said on a podcast a while ago that sex outside of marriage is always dehumanizing, which insinuated that sex inside of marriage was always humanizing, which it is not. And I would argue that it isn't always dehumanizing outside of marriage either. So what is an ethic that would apply when we're both single or married? And I think I can't say it in one word, but the three words that come to mind are dignity, respect, and intimacy. So I think that God created us with drives for intimacy, and that those drives are met in different ways, and we all need intimacy. And intimacy is rooted in vulnerability, and it's rooted in trust. You can't be vulnerable if you can't trust someone. And so we all need those people in our lives that we're able to be vulnerable with, whether it's sexual or not. And we need to be pursuing that. And then if we are pursuing a sexual relationship, it should grow out of that. It shouldn't be something which is separate from vulnerability and intimacy. And I think it should also be dignified, which means, and I don't mean like dignified, like, I don't know, like Queen Elizabeth or something, but but we should honor the humanity in the other. And I think that there is a lot of drive for sex, which is very focused on power and control and on humiliation, especially humiliation of the female, which I find very problematic. And then we should just respect one another, respect one another's boundaries, respect who they are, and respect in terms of also caring about, I guess, the concern that Nadia Bolz-Weber would say, the concern that we're treating each other. I know in the secular world too, they often speak only about consent, and I would argue that consent falls under respect and under dignity, and it's important. But it goes beyond that, because just because it's consensual doesn't mean that it is something which is humanizing and intimate.
Yeah. And you've read a lot more of this than I have, of course, but in the more careful ethical literature, it's not just consent. It's much deeper and more robust than that. Consent is an outgrowth of a deeper ethic. So good. So you mentioned intimacy, so I'm going to skip to my question about that because I think it's related. So you do still say, if I understood correctly, in The Great Sex Rescue, or you at least recommend to wait to have sex until marriage, but you say build intimacy first. So I'm wondering why you think that. Do you think that's an entailment? Do you think that's a result that just happens for some people because of prior commitments? Do you think that's normative? And also, why not build that intimacy before marriage by having sex? Have you come across any research that suggests that sex before marriage has any negative consequences? If so, intrinsically, right?
Yeah. Okay. So interesting stat for you. This didn't make it into The Great Sex Rescue. It made it into our books, The Good Girl's Guide to Great Sex and Good Guy's Guide to Great Sex. So you haven't read this one, but you'll like it. When we compare women who have only ever had sex with their husbands, and we controlled for sexual abuse, so no history of abuse, and they've only ever had the one sexual partner. If you wait for marriage, there's a 25% higher rate of vaginismus, which is a female sexual dysfunction, where the muscles of the vaginal wall contract and sex becomes really painful, if not impossible. So basically, waiting for marriage makes sex more painful for many women. Does that mean that I think that you should have sex before marriage? No, I don't necessarily think so, but I do think there's a real problem with the way that we're doing the honeymoon and with the pressure that we're putting on couples. If you look at people who only ever had sex with each other, there doesn't seem to be anything demonstrably bad with having sex before marriage versus after marriage.
Okay.
And if you look at people who had multiple sexual partners, like 2 to 3 doesn't seem to hurt people. Once you get into higher numbers, there does seem to be, but there is a statistical difference, but it's not huge. So that's what the research says. The question of whether you need to wait until marriage or not. I mean, what was marriage in biblical times? Like that's the question, right? When I do a lot of genealogy, and I have family that were not Church of England. We became Methodists and Wesleyans very early. And so I have several ancestors who got married and baptized their kids all on the same day because the pastor was only coming through like once every 5 years, Yep. So it's like, were they not married then before, and it gets just really tricky. And yeah, I don't know. I think you need a philosopher or the theologian for that one. I don't know if I can make a pronouncement on that.
Yeah, but I'm punting it to you because I don't want to make the
Yeah, my problem always is like, to be honest, in the data, we see no difference if you had sex when you were engaged versus if you were married. It's honest, there is no difference. The only difference is the higher rate of sexual pain if you wait.
Right.
My problem is, I think if we say, hey, you know what, you can have sex as long as you're with the person you're going to marry, we're going to get 15-year-olds saying, but I'm going to marry him. Brett is just so perfect.
Yeah.
Brett is my soulmate, and so like it really does look like as long as you're with the person you truly are committed to, there's no problem. But how do you, once you say that, how do you know that, right? So
Sure.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that answer. It's very honest. So just one quick follow up. You mentioned you're going to root your ethic in something like dignity, respect, intimacy. You also mentioned kindness in the book, and I thought this was a place you might go, and I think it's a worthy place to go. So you said at one point something along the lines of, this is not a direct quote, but that a piece of sex advice that you often give people, or a kind of a warning, I guess, that you give people, is that if they hear some advice from whoever, their church leader or whoever, that results in one person getting everything they want and the other person getting nothing they want, especially if it's at the expense of the other, that's probably not Christ-like.
Yes.
Just this basic intuition of what kindness looks like, and is that actually being played out in your sex life? Can you expand on that a little bit? Maybe give an example.
Yeah, the classic example for that, which we used in that section, was the postpartum advice that is given in so many of our books. So in Sheet Music by Kevin Lehman, for instance, which is one of the best-selling sex manuals, he says that during the postpartum phase, or if she has really heavy periods, or if she's simply not feeling well, she can make use of something that they euphemistically call hand jobs, so that when he's ready to climb the walls. And elsewhere in the same book, he says that her period is a really difficult time for her husband. Just think about that for a minute. Okay. And so he talks about how one woman learned that giving oral sex during her period helped him go the 5 days without having to watch pornography. Yeah. I mean, any sexual ethic that tells a guy that when your wife has pushed a baby out of her vagina and is bleeding heavily now and isn't sleeping, and her milk is just coming in, and she's trying to get this baby to feed, and she's exhausted, that her priority should be making sure that he gets release in some way, that is not kind, and that is not dignifying, and that is not respectful, and that's not anything.
Yeah, that's good.
I was raised on that. Like, pastor of a big church from up front was like, ladies, you need to be having sex every 72 hours with your husband. Yep. If you're not, you're not doing your duty.
Do you know where that came from?
No.
The 72-hour rule?
No.
Okay, we looked it up because it's in all kinds of books. We found it in Power of Praying Wife, in Every Man's Battle, in Sheet Music. Multiple books talk about how men need it every 72 hours. So we went to the medical literature and we looked at, like, is there something magical about hour 73 where he gets more uncomfortable? Nothing, absolutely nothing in the medical literature. We finally traced it back to something that James Dobson said in 1977 with absolutely no citation. And people have just taken it from then that men need sex every 72 hours.
Yeah.
I mean, James Dobson is really...
Did he need a citation?
Authoritative.
Really?
Yeah. No.
Now, I can say, though, like, when you have really good marital satisfaction, so when your marriage is already good, having sex more often is a good thing. It does improve it. It helps you be happier until a certain point. Then there's a big drop off. Like, couples who have sex every day, that's bad. That's actually negative because there's usually something else going on, right? So it's not that having sex every 72 hours is bad, but as soon as you say you have to, all kinds of terrible things happen because obligation is awful for women.
Can you explain that?
Yeah. So, one of the things that we measured in Great Sex Rescue is the belief that a wife is obligated to give her husband sex when he wants it. And when she believes that, her chance of experiencing sexual pain or vaginismus increases to almost the same extent as if she had been abused. Because our bodies interpret obligation as trauma.
Wow. So
if sex is supposed to be intimate, which I believe that it is, obligation erases that, because obligation says your needs don't matter. Whatever you want, it doesn't matter compared to what he does. And so you get erased. And when we tell women you don't matter, just what he wants matters, that is essentially an abusive statement. And this is largely what Christian teaching has been based on, or evangelical teaching has been based on with regards to sex, is that men have needs and women need to meet those needs, or else he will be very tempted and look elsewhere.
Wow. I need to read The Great Sex Rescue.
You should. It's a great book.
Yeah. So jumping back to She Deserves Better. This is pretty impressive that you're able to just like right off the bat field questions on both books, Sheila. So chapter 7 of She Deserves Better, which is she deserves to know about her body. I found that particularly fascinating. In it, you talk about how healthy, and you alluded to this, but I want to actually flesh it out some more. I've got not just a 16-year-old daughter, but I've got a couple of boys in middle school who we live in a city where they changed the human growth development curriculum to be a lot more robust. And so we've had tons of people coming in from out of town to protest at school board meetings and talk about how this is terrible. And there's this, trans LGBTQ agenda and blah, blah, blah. You say, quite frankly, I'm quoting you now. You say, quite frankly, the evangelical church has been lying to our teens for decades. Can you elaborate on that statement?
So much of our sex ed was based on, if you have sex, terrible, terrible things will happen. And The Bride Wore White by Dana Gresh, it keeps repeating the phrase, no babies ever. Like, you will get rendered infertile from STDs. In Every Young Woman's Battle, Josh McDowell wrote the foreword, and he talked about how if you want to see your grandchildren, don't have sex now because you have a higher rate of death and STDs. And they were explaining it almost like the gym coach in Mean Girls. Do you know that scene, right? Don't have sex or you will get pregnant and you will die. And that's largely what we told our kids. You will get pregnant, you will die. Here's the problem. All of our kids have friends who are having sex, who are not pregnant, who are not riddled with STDs, and who are not dead. And while, yes, sex has a lot of risks, to be quite honest, condoms are really quite effective. And there are vaccines against some STDs now. And if we're simply relying on scare tactics to stop our kids from having sex, it's not going to work. We need to tell our kids, sure, absolutely tell our kids about pregnancy and STDs, but we need to also tell them about condoms because they do largely work. And, you don't want your kid having sex. Like, nobody wants their 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old kid having sex. Like, you don't. But if they are going to, you at least want them to know that they can wear a condom and they should wear a condom.
Yep. So.
And here's something interesting. Sorry, I just got to throw this one in. Other research, ours didn't ask specifically about this, but there have been multiple peer-reviewed studies that have shown that kids are much less likely to use condoms and much more likely to be involved in risky sexual behavior if they do not have proper sex ed. So it's not like telling them about it makes them more likely to do it. When you don't tell them about it, bad things happen.
Interesting. So as a follow-up, you say, you speak to how the more LGBTQ teens who are exposed to sex ed are more healthy and less likely to self-harm and less likely to suffer from mental illness and bullying. In a current climate that we live in, politicians are manipulating fearful Christians into thinking that sex education is a woke agenda and gay and trans people are trying to indoctrinate our kids. Can you share some of your research and experience around this stuff? Because it's very prevalent to our culture right now.
Yeah, we didn't actually look at a lot of LGBTQ stuff in our survey. So I can only share with you what other peer-reviewed studies have shown. But like LGBTQ youth, trans youth are far more likely to be bullied and to engage in risky sexual behaviors and to get hurt in that. So if you want your child not to do those things, they do need sex ed. And LGBTQ kids especially need to be taught about consent because LGBTQ youth are far more likely to get involved in abusive relationships with adults. So they need to understand consent. And they need to understand power dynamics. They need to be protected because if they feel like they are not safe at home, they will look for other adult spaces to be safe in, and they can be easily taken advantage of in those adult spaces. And these kids are still kids, and they still deserve to be protected and to be cared for.
Get into that.
Yep.
So while we're on the topic of sex ed, I wanted to ask, can you say a bit about the importance of communication around sex in relationships? It's something you talk a lot about in The Great Sex Rescue, and how sex ed can either help or hinder that. And as kind of a dumb segue, like I was recently listening to a podcast with Dan Savage. I don't know if you know him, but he's like a very well-known sex blogger. And he said to the person interviewing him that gay people are better at sex than straight people. He's very intentionally provocative, but his justification was because we have to talk about it. He said the first thing that a gay man will say to another gay man when they're about to have an encounter is, "What are you into?" And that completely changes the dynamics of the encounter in a way that straight people, frankly, have a hard time understanding. This is his claim. But some of what you said in that book mirrored that from a very different perspective. And so, I wanted to ask you about communication, how to do it better, and how sex ed influences that.
Well, first of all, Dan Savage is right to a certain extent, because if you look at the orgasm gap, it's huge in heterosexual relationships, much larger than in homosexual relationships. Like the people that are the least likely to reach orgasm are women in heterosexual relationships.
Yeah.
And the people that are most likely are men in heterosexual relationships. So, in the evangelical church, we have a 47-point orgasm gap, meaning that 95% of men almost always reach orgasm in a given sexual encounter, but only 48% of women do. That's a 47-point gap. If you look at lesbian relationships, you're looking at over 80% orgasm rates. I forget what the rates are for men in same-sex relationships, but there's a problem there. And so I don't know if it's only communication. I think it's also the dynamics of what we expect from sex, because we don't actually expect women to enjoy sex or want sex in heterosexual relationships. We expect sex to be primarily focused on the man. Like even the question, what is sex? See, in a same-sex lesbian relationship, sex is doing things to each other to bring each other to orgasm. In a heterosexual relationship, sex is man puts penis into vagina, moves around until he climaxes. So his climax is the focus of sex. Like if you were to ask a couple, did you have sex last night? That's what they think you're asking. Did he put his penis, vagina, move around, climax, right?
That's very good.
But and so whether or not she enjoyed herself, it would still count as having sex. And when we did follow-up surveys with men and we said, do you do enough foreplay? If she frequently orgasms, over 90% of men say they do, which is great, yay for you. But if she doesn't frequently orgasm, 72% of guys still say, yes, I do enough foreplay. So if she doesn't orgasm, it's not his fault. There's something wrong with her. And that tends to be the way that we have framed it, is we don't give a lot of sex ed, and She Deserves Better. Oh gosh, I wish I could remember the number. There's 3 authors on the book, so I'm the one who writes it. My daughter Rebecca edits and puts in all the snarky stuff, and she does the focus groups and she writes the surveys, and then Joanna Sawatsky does all our stats. And so I'm not the stats person, but I believe the number is like over 20 to 30% of women did not even know the female orgasm existed until after the age of 20.
Jeez.
Wow.
So you can see why there's a problem with a lot of evangelical women going into marriage and going into a sexual relationship in marriage, is that we don't even know that we're supposed to orgasm. And when the point is you need to have sex to keep him topped up, then is her pleasure even a priority? And in many cases, it's not. Like when pastors tell people have sex every 72 hours, they don't mean make sure she orgasms every 72 hours. They mean make sure he does.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, I mean, that's not really answering your question. Yes, we need to communicate more, but I really think it's more about what we expect.
Yeah.
Because when people say, like, if you go into marriage counseling and they're trying to figure out if there's sex problems, they usually say, well, how many times do you have sex a week? They don't say, how many times does she orgasm a week?
Yeah.
We need to change our terminology.
Mhm.
Kind of building off of this, but changing topics a little bit. In chapter 9, you talk about modesty and the way we teach modesty to our girls. Teen girls and young women have been taught about modesty, and you say it's pretty much almost all bad. You were very, very clear. It's almost all bad. So can you tell our listeners about this idea of modesty and the effects it has on girls and young women?
This was the one chapter that Rebecca sketched out first. This is her anthem as a girl who
You
grew
feel
up
the snark. It's good. Yep.
in purity culture. And when we were recording the audiobook, she read most of this chapter and she couldn't get through it without crying because there are parts of it that are horrifying. The things that we said to girls. It is really horrifying. We measured 4 different iterations of the modesty message because we really wanted to drill down on this. And so the 4 messages were: boys are visual in a way that girls will never understand. Boys can't help but lust if a girl is dressed like she's trying to incite it. A girl has a responsibility not to be a stumbling block to the boys around her by what she dresses, how she dresses. And girls who dress immodestly are worse than those who don't. And we let the survey taker define what worst was. We just wanted to see what they would say. And all 4 messages are terrible. Like, you look long-term, they lower self-esteem, make it more likely to marry an abuser, worse marital and sexual satisfaction. You're even more likely to get harassed and abused in church. So churches that teach these messages are inherently more dangerous for teen girls. But the 2 messages that are the worst are the ones about boys. So boys are visual in a way that girls will never understand. Boys can't help but lust. Because they tell girls, this world isn't safe for you. Guys are incapable of treating you well. They will always objectify you no matter what. And that's just how God made boys, because that's how it's phrased too. Isn't it wonderful that this is how God made boys' bodies, that they are drawn to us? And this is supposed to be a wonderful thing. And when girls believe those messages, they're 52% more likely to experience sexual pain as an adult. They're 68% more likely to marry an abuser. They're 30% more likely to have low self-esteem. It's bad.
Statistically bad.
Yeah. It's bad. And can I tell you about the worst one? The one that just really got to us example was Dana Gresh wrote a curriculum called Secret Keeper Girl. Sold hundreds of thousands of copies. There was an event that went across North America, a Secret Keeper Girl event, where it taught girls how to dress modestly. It was aimed at girls 8 to 12. And in one of the particular exercises that moms were supposed to do with their daughters, there were these modesty tests. And one of them was called Raise and Praise. So you're supposed to put your arms in the air. And if any belly showed, that was bad, because bellies are intoxicating. And then she goes on to have this conversation that she scripts out that moms should have with their daughters. So, do you know what intoxicating means? It's like when you're drunk and you get out of control. And God made our bodies to intoxicate men. But you're only supposed to be intoxicating to one man, the man that you will marry. And so we need to cover up to make sure that we don't intoxicate other men. And this is a wonderful thing, that God made our bodies to intoxicate and that he is drawn to us. She told 8-year-old girls that the sight of their belly could make an adult man out of control. And no one said anything.
Yep.
Yeah. Yep. It makes so much sense when you're talking about it like this, but when you're actually in it, it's just like, oh, I guess we have to go along with this. This sounds wise. What's a better alternative to teaching modesty than, Sheila?
Never, ever, ever pair it with anything to do with lust. It's not about lust. The Bible never pairs it with lust. When Jesus talks about lust, he talks about the guy. He doesn't talk about what she's wearing. And the passages in scripture where they talk about modesty are about not flaunting your wealth.
Yeah. Weirdly, in all those sermons I heard about like purity culture and modesty, I never heard any pastor say that dudes should gouge out their eyes.
Yeah, but you know what? Jesus did. We walk through, and She Deserves Better. We have some exercises that walk through conversations that you can have with your daughter about it. But stress the things the Bible does. Are you being kind with what you wear? And that means don't wear clothing that is going to intimidate others, that is going to make others feel left out. If you're going to go around wearing a Confederate flag t-shirt, that's not a good thing. Like, let's be kind with what we wear. Let's not flaunt wealth, and let's be appropriate for the occasion.
Mhm.
So if you're going water skiing, don't wear a skimpy bikini because that thing can fall off. If you're going to go babysit a bunch of toddlers, then don't wear a cute little sundress because it's going to be flying up all the time. And, so just wear what's appropriate for the occasion. And that applies to guys too. Like, that's the thing. All of the modesty rules, they don't need to be gendered.
Yes.
Guys should be wearing what's appropriate for the occasion as well. Guys should be being kind. Guys shouldn't be flaunting their wealth, like the sneakers that some preachers wear and the watches that some preachers wear. My goodness.
This gets to my next question, which is basically, I think that betrays that unwillingness to see that it clearly applies to men too, that these modesty standards just almost one for one go in both directions. The unwillingness to see that or admit that betrays a really low view of men.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to ask you, why do you think evangelical sex books are so infantilizing to men? Again, not having read any of them, that was one of my main takeaways from your book, was evangelicals really seem to have a low view of men. It's really sad. Where does it come from?
Yeah, and we traced that in Great Sex Rescue. We measured the belief that all men struggle with lust. It's every man's battle, that a woman should have frequent sex to keep her husband from watching porn, and she deserves better. We looked at the lust messages. We also measured boys have a hard time stopping in a makeout situation, so a girl is responsible to stop the sexual progression. So this idea that boys can't help it, men can't help it, everyone struggles with lust. Every man's battle literally says we find another reason for sexual sin among men. We got there naturally simply by being male.
Ooh.
And in their companion book, Every Heart Restored, they said men just don't naturally have that Christian view of sex.
That's literally heretical. Jesus was a dude.
Yeah.
Naturally sinful. Like, you've violated the creed, buddy, and they're supposed to care about that.
Yeah. And like, self-control is a fruit of the spirit.
Yeah.
The Bible doesn't talk about lust as being in a particular category of sin, which cannot be defeated. Like, the Bible does not say that lust is men's sin, but we have made it into that. And I think the reason that we infantilize men so much is largely because the church is very male dominated, right? There's men at the top. And men don't want to be held accountable. There's an awful lot of guys watching porn. They want to keep watching porn, and they would rather blame women for their problems than own it themselves.
So let me real quick, because we referenced it at the beginning of this interview that you've been on, dozens of interviews for this book in particular, probably, a couple hundred all told with all your books. You were recently on Theology in the Raw with Preston Sprinkle, and I listened to a bit of it, and I'd never heard him talk at all. I'd never read any of his books. Whatever. And I was a little bit shocked about how much he was pushing back on what you and Rebecca were bringing, and how I was shocked by his tone. I was shocked by what he was bringing. And I felt I had a lot of respect for you and your daughter by the way you engaged with him, and thought it was absolute ridiculousness. Now, I can say those strong things because I'm not you, but I'm just interested in what's the response to that been, and what's your take on that conversation?
I have two takes. The first is I'm very glad it happened. I think it was a really productive conversation. We were talking mostly about modesty and consent, were the parts that he was pushing back on. So, he was talking about how he wanted his girls to cover up so that they weren't ogled so much. And, we explained that what you're wearing doesn't prevent harassment. And what our girls need to be told instead is that they can stand up for themselves, and how to recognize red flags. And then when we talked about consent, I got the impression that he was really saying that boys have such a hard time stopping. And this is where my daughter Rebecca is a rock star. She's really good in these situations, and it was her who was mostly pushing back.
Yeah.
But when we say that boys can't stop, what we're saying is boys can't help but rape you.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I thought the conversation was really productive because he was voicing a lot of things that many people believe. And I pushed back initially, and then Rebecca took over and was just quite assertive
She was.
on that. And
Be assertive.
a lot of people were really grateful for that because they finally put words to some of the things that they were thinking, and they knew how to push back now on those same ideas. So on that sense, I was really happy with the conversation because it needed to be had because so many people still believe these things. On the other hand, sometimes it just gets tiring. It's just kind of tiring.
Yep. Yep.
And hard to think that so many people do still think that.
Yep.
Yeah.
So
yeah, no, I get it. I've got other words for it. But I'll save those. But I would say, yeah, I think you're right. It's a good listen for those of us who are struggling with how to navigate through this stuff, because a lot of us have to unlearn things. Like most of us who grew up in the evangelical church have to unlearn things, and it felt like Preston was he was confronted by how much he has to unlearn through the course of that conversation. He could have been a lot more gracious and honest about that, but good for you guys. Like I was really grateful for both of you and the presence that you brought. If anything, I wanted him to get slapped a little harder, but yeah, thanks for
non-violently, of course. Listeners, don't write us.
Absolutely, 100%.
And for those who listen to that podcast, you might get a kick out of this, but we now have anti-rape raccoon merch in our store. But it's an inside joke. You'll have to listen.
It is.
We do have anti-rape raccoon merch. Yeah.
So I do want to hit on this because I think it's so important, even though you've already spoken about it earlier, Sheila. We're almost done here. But you talk about how teaching about virginity and the virtue of protecting your virginity is the most important thing for a young person to protect and value. Again, how do we build out a robust sexual ethic as we're parenting our kids, particularly our daughters, in a way that doesn't hold virginity up as the end all be all, while trying to, I'm just asking you, how do I talk to my daughter again about this in ways that doesn't make it seem like she has to stay a virgin or she's going to be like lose everything, but still want to honor her boyfriend. She has a boyfriend, and I want them to honor one another and care for one another and love one another. How do we talk about this without going to these binaries?
I mean, I think it's perfectly fine just to tell your daughter, hey, here's what I'd like for you. Like just be honest, here's what I want for you. And that means being honest with yourself, because a lot of us, we don't want our kids having sex because picturing them having sex means they're growing up and we want them to stay a kid. And like, we're all messed up in our head about that. Like, it's about how we feel. It's not actually about what's best for them. It's about how we feel. And that's not a good enough reason. Right. It has to be about how do I want to care for you, and what do I want for you? What do I think is best for you? And it's fine to talk to them about that. This is why I'd like you to wait. This is why I think, this is what I think God thinks, but we all need to think about that ourselves. But this is why I'd like you to wait. And I think that's what's best for you. But that's different from saying that if they are no longer a virgin, and that's what we did. We told girls their most precious treasure, their most precious gift, that was their virginity. If we instead say to our daughters, I want you to be safe. I want you to be wise. I want you to honor yourself. I want you to honor the person you're with. Then let's say one day your daughter does go further than she wanted to, and she doesn't actually like that about herself. And she's like, man, I wish I hadn't done that. Then she can pray about it and she can be okay with it. And then the next time she can say, no, you know what? I don't want to do that again.
Yeah.
I think I'm just not going to do that now. And I'm going to choose something else. And it's okay. But if we've told her that she needs to protect her virginity, then once it's gone, why does she say no now?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And that goes for boys too.
Yep. Absolutely. 100%. I'm just realizing that I didn't ask for her consent to bring her into this. So if you're listening to this question, it's because my daughter now has given me consent to actually share this with the world.
Yeah, otherwise, time taking all those references out.
Yes. You got another one, Kyle?
No, I'm good.
You're good. We don't have anything else down in the outline, but Sheila, but I want to, I'm just going to ask you a broad question so that we can kind of have this like great question just to land this on. So Kai read The Great Sex Rescue, which is so beneficial. She deserves more, or she deserves better, is just this rich, mature, nuanced, researched, and beautiful way of embracing our sexuality and raising our daughters differently and teaching the church differently about sex. There's so much to it. Can you just, as a pastor, me and other pastors are looking for ways to just talk about sex in really healthy ways, and framing sex in ways that are edifying and that bring about maturity in our congregations and in their discipleship. And we don't have a good grid for that. We haven't been taught well of how to pastor our congregations, how to set a culture that is based on flourishing and beauty and goodness when it comes to sex and sexuality. Can help us, pastors.
Sex is not a sin management tool. I think often we have promoted sex as a sin management tool. So have sex so that you don't lust, so that you don't watch porn, so that you're able to love each other better, so that you don't snap at each other. Sex is supposed to be this thing that you do so that bad things don't happen. Do you know what it's called when we have sex to avoid something bad from happening? It's called coercion. Our sexual ethic has largely been about coercing people. And we've done that under the guise of God created men to have this great need. And so God created women to meet that great need. And we haven't seen sex as a beautiful gift of mutuality.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever we make sex into something which is more of an individual need, rather than an expression of a relationship in mutuality, then we've really cheapened it, because we're not animals. We are animals, but we're not only animals. And often the way we talk about sex makes it sound like we're only animals.
Mm-hmm.
And I think redeeming sex is putting it back in its proper place, which means that it is about two people, mutuality, intimacy, and that ultimately means pleasure for both too. And 16-year-olds grope in the back of a car, it's not going to be mutual, intimate, and pleasurable for both. Mm-hmm. And adults who are married having sex to make sure that he doesn't watch porn, that's not going to be mutual, intimate, and pleasurable for both either.
Light stuff here.
Yeah.
Yeah, Sheila, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's been great to be here.